According to Retire Fearlessly, the top 2 states to retire to are South Carolina and Florida. This is a conversation that I have often. People are either contemplating moving up to South Carolina or moving down to Florida to retire. And I also get it from people that are just thinking about making a general move. South Carolina and Florida have had heavy incoming traffic in the last couple of years for a lot of great reasons. I'm gonna go through the pros and cons of each state in this video to help you decide where you either want to retire or move to in the near future. Hi, I'm Evan Whaley, your favorite Greenville realtor. So I'm gonna compare Florida and South Carolina in this video. Florida and South Carolina have had a lot of people moving to them, whether it be retirees or just people looking to relocate in general over the last few years, and for a lot of great reasons. There's some great natural climate that's here. You've got some wonderful beaches in both states. You've got some great golf courses. You've got a lot of healthcare amenities. There's a lot of really wonderful things to love about South Carolina and Florida. I'm gonna talk about all the specifics in this video, and we're gonna let South Carolina and Florida go head to head and see which state is the best state for someone to move to. First thing I wanted to compare was the overall cost of living to give you the big picture view. I looked at a study and they looked at what is the value of $100. And they looked at overall national average for all 50 states here in the US when they looked at $100. They said in South Carolina, your $100 would actually be worth $106.30. If we look at Florida, your money would be worth $98.60, making South Carolina the winner in overall cost of living. Next, let's look at taxes. South Carolina and Florida are both thought to be very tax-friendly states. If I look at a Wallet Hub study that was done recently, it looks like Florida is actually ranked overall as the 6th lowest state for taxation and South Carolina is the 12th lowest. Of course, everyone's situation differs and one state could be better than the other depending on your situation. When we look at South Carolina and Florida as a whole, both states do not have taxes on inheritances. They don't have taxes on estates, they don't have taxes on Social Security, and both generally have very low property taxes. Where Florida has a bit of an advantage over South Carolina is actually they don't have a state income tax. They don't have a state income tax, and they also don't tax on pension or retirement income, which is one of the reasons why it's become such a popular retirement destination. South Carolina, again, is still very tax friendly, and depending on the sources of income that you have, and depending on your property values, it might be a better tax advantage in South Carolina than Florida, but you definitely want to talk to someone about your particular situation. But in this case, I've got to give the win to Florida on taxes. The Kaiser Family Foundation did a study on the overall healthcare cost in South Carolina and Florida. The quick version of it is that they found that South Carolina has more affordable healthcare costs than the state of Florida. On average, the cost in South Carolina is between 88 to 91% of what the costs are in Florida, making South Carolina more affordable from a healthcare standpoint. So naturally it would sound like South Carolina would win when it comes to healthcare. But there's another side of this that you should know about. If you move to one of the smaller cities in South Carolina, they have found that healthcare is not as readily available. Now, if you move to the larger cities like Greenville, Charleston, Columbia, Hilton Head, Myrtle Beach, etc., they're going to have plenty of healthcare options, but some of the smaller, more rural states, they found that people had to commute further for healthcare options than they did in Florida. Saying all that, I am going to give the win to South Carolina on this one, but it's close and it is something that you should make sure that you note. Next, when we evaluate transportation, South Carolina's gas costs are 7% lower on average. They have a lower cost for a new vehicle. The state taxes, they're done a little weird in both places and they have some variance, but overall it looks like they're a little bit lower in South Carolina. Typical DMV fees, I found that South Carolina was around $49 and Florida ranged anywhere from $86 all the way up to $174. Florida had a state use tax of 6% on all vehicles. South Carolina has a range and it ranges anywhere from 6% all the way up to a little over 10%. In Greenville County, it's actually at 6%, so it would be a match, but in different parts of the state of South Carolina, vehicle taxes can be higher, and it's all based on the different district that you're in. With all that said, the cost of a vehicle are gonna be pretty similar. It sounds like South Carolina might edge out Florida, but it's gonna be so close. We also found that the resale market in Florida is better than it is in South Carolina. There's just been more inventory. Overall, this one's gotta be a tie. I gotta say that it's too close to call. I'm gonna call this one a tie. Next, let's look at housing. I couldn't pull great data that looked at the whole state view for both South Carolina and Florida that would be the same, but what I could find is looking in specific counties. So what I did, I'm here in Greenville County, so I decided to use Greenville County versus Sarasota. The reason I use Sarasota is it is the #1 retirement place in Florida. So I decided to compare apples to apples here. When we look at housing costs from Greenville to Sarasota, we found that the cost of an actual home was 29.1% cheaper in Greenville County than it is in Sarasota. If we look at the median price for a home, it's 21% less in Greenville compared to Sarasota. Greenville did have a 2.9% higher utility costs than Sarasota. But overall, when we factor in the large percentage and the difference between housing and overall housing cost, we find that Greenville is a more affordable place for housing, giving South Carolina the win in this category. Now let's look at homeowners insurance. What we tried to do is keep everything consistent. Let's just look at a $300,000 dwelling, a $300,000 coverage with a $1,000 deductible. The cost nationally for that coverage would be $1,872 for the year, making that $152 per month. Now, South Carolina and Florida actually have higher insurance premiums than the national average. Florida historically has some of the highest insurance premiums due to flooding, due to heavy rainfall, due to hurricanes. When we look at Florida, the premium for that level of coverage would be $2,385 for the year, making that $199 a month. South Carolina in certain parts of the state also has some similar issues that Florida has. South Carolina does not get hit with as many hurricanes because it does not have as large of a shoreline as Florida does, and due to its approximate location. And South Carolina has less flooding incidents overall. So the insurance premiums tend to be a little bit lower, but they're still above the national average. In South Carolina, that same level of coverage that we've been talking about would cost you $2,055, making the cost $171 a month. The numbers kind of blew me away that was the South Carolina average. So I actually went and looked at Greenville's average, and it's much lower than the average for South Carolina. When we're factoring in South Carolina as a whole, we of course have some coastal areas that have much higher costs for insurance premiums. Here in Greenville, the average cost is $1,630. So overall, South Carolina would be the winner in this equation. Of course, if you're in a coastal area in South Carolina and you're contemplating moving more inland in Florida, it's likely that your insurance premium wouldn't be much different, or maybe a little bit more costly in South Carolina. So just keep that in mind as you're comparing these two states. Now, of course, you're not just moving to a place for a cost of living, so let's talk about some of the other factors. One of the big things that we should talk about is weather. When we look at the climates in both states, both of them tend to have more mild climates. And it will vary in South Carolina if you're in the low country or if you're in the upstate where I'm at for the climate. But let's just talk about the states as a whole. When we look at Florida as a whole, it's got a humid subtropical climate. It's got very mild winters. You have very little winter, if any. And so that can be something that people really love and are attracted to. In South Carolina, overall, you're still going to have a very humid and hot summer. Depending on where you're at in the state, you might get a very similar temperature to Florida. For instance, if you're living in the low country, you might experience very similar climates as what Florida gets. Now, if you're here in the upstate, you'll experience more of the full 4-season effect. Both states are going to get a little heavier than average rainfall, more thunderstorms than the national average. If I got to pick a winner when it comes to climate, I've got to say that this one is going to really depend on the person. So I'll call this one a tie, but I wanted to make sure you had the information. Next category we're going to talk about is the beaches. Florida has over 800 miles of sandy shoreline, and South Carolina has over 1,600 miles of sandy shoreline. Overall, there are many different beaches in both states, both of which are thought of nationally as some of the best beaches in the country. If you've got to pick a winner here, that's really tough because it's going to depend on the beaches that you go to and what environment that you're looking for. You've got some more commercialized beaches to everything is private beaches in both states. So if we had to pick an overall winner, I just did some searching. It looked like Florida might edge out South Carolina slightly on an overall search just due to the temperature in Florida and being able to have access to the beach longer. The beach quality in both places is thought of very highly, but I've got to give the win to Florida on this one just because you can use the beach longer and more often. Next, let's look at golfing. Both states have some incredible golf courses. Both even have golf courses that have been featured on PGA Tour events. So if you've got to pick an overall winner, I think Florida is going to win just due to the overall volume of golf courses that they have compared to South Carolina. But you couldn't go wrong as a golfer in both places if you pick the right city in both states. But I'll give the win to Florida on this one. Lastly, let's look at natural disasters. Someone did an impact study to see which state had the highest level of natural disasters. Florida happened to be the number 4 most impacted state from natural disasters, where South Carolina happened to be the number 19 state. Overall, we know there's been a lot of really unfortunate things in Florida as far as hurricanes and flooding recently. In South Carolina, we have seen some of that as well. And on the coastline, you do get flooding and hurricane threats as well. South Carolina has been lucky to not be as impacted as Florida has been recently. Overall, it looks like South Carolina is going to have less natural disasters than Florida. When I tally everything up at the end of this video, it looks like there's a couple ties. South Carolina won in 6 categories and Florida won in 3. Now that doesn't mean that South Carolina is necessarily the best place for everyone to move to. There's a lot of great reasons to move to South Carolina, but there's also a lot of great reasons to move to Florida. When I look at the overall categories where I put South Carolina as the winner, there were 6 of them. The 6 categories included housing, it was lower cost there, homeowners insurance, it was a lower overall cost of living, there was lower cost for healthcare, lower cost for transportation, and last, there was less natural disasters. When we look at the wins for Florida, Florida would win due to the golf courses, the beaches, and lastly, due to lower overall taxes. South Carolina and Florida are overall amazing states to live in. There's a lot of pros to living in both, and depending on your particular situation, one might fit better for you than the other. I wanted to just give you the information and compare things from a data perspective to help you make the most informed decision possible. I'm curious, what in this video was the most shocking revelation to you? And if you have any questions about moving to the state of South Carolina, I've lived in several different places in the state. I'd love to be a resource for you and see what I can do to help. All my contact information will be in the description down below.